Hi, welcome back to Talk Write, your source of all things writing and literature. If you have watched all 10 or so of my videos before, you will know that I usually spend time talking about some of my favorite poems and what makes them tick. Today, what I would like to do is look at the first few pages of one of my favorite novels, which is Charles Dickens' Bleak House. This is considered a justly famous novel, and Dickens is justly considered a master of prose. But where exactly do these ideas come from? Well, look no further than the opening pages of Bleak House, and you will see just how majestic Charles Dickens is as a writer and as a creator of not only setting, but city and theme and character. So we are going to begin by looking at the opening pages of Bleak House and why they are regarded as some of the most famous pages in all of Charles Dickens' work. All right. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. And it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs undistinguishable in mire. Horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas, and a general infection of ill temper, in losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if the day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement, and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river, where it flows among green ights and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats. Fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards. Fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper, down in his close cabin. Fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. Chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all around them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may, from the spongy fields, be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of the leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor and his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering conditions which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. On such an afternoon, if ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog. On such an afternoon, some score of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as here they are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless cause, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat hair and horsehair warded heads against walls of words, and making a pretense of equity with serious faces, as players might. On such an afternoon, the various solicitors in the cause, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, who made a fortune by it, ought to be, as they are not, ranged in a line in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, Between the register's red table and the silk gowns, with bills, cross bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, references to masters' reports, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. Well may the court be dim, with wasting candles here and there. Well may the fog hang heavy in it, as if it would never get out. Well may the stained glass windows lose their color and admit no light of day into the place. Well may the uninitiated from the streets, who peep in through the glass panes in the door, be deterred from entrance by its owlish aspect, and by the drawl languidly echoing to the roof from the padded dais, where the Lord High Chancellor looks into the lantern that has no light in it, and where the attendant wigs are all stuck in a fog bank. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse, and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress, borrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearing out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honorable man among its practitioners who would not give, who does not often give, the warning, suffer any wrong that can be done you, rather than come here. All right, I've read this so many times, and each time I read it, I am just astounded at how well constructed this whole beginning is. I mean, Dickens does so many things that are just absolutely incredible, and what I want to do now is touch on, I think, 3 of the ones that always stick out to me. Now, the first, and it should be quite obvious, is the syntax. Just looking at the first few sentences, we have this very clipped, almost courtly reportage. Listen. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord High Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall, implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet an megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Now, even that last sentence is not grammatically correct. None of these sentences are grammatically correct. You might imagine someone who is just taking notes, taking briefs, and jotting down their initial impressions. London, Michaelmas term, November, mud in the streets, etc. That is absolutely on purpose. Dickens is giving us this sort of reporter-esque quality of point of view, looking at really Chancery, Lincoln's Inn Hall, Temple Bar, London on a very foggy day. What this device also allows Dickens to do is to pile up huge amounts of detail with these really clipped sentences. And a clipped sentence is so good for moving you ahead a little bit faster. Your eye immediately scans the ending of the sentence and jumps to the next one. So it's actually a way to increase pace. Now, Dickens does that, although he does it to establish setting, not to do any sort of action scene. The other point I made about this was that it allows Dickens to accumulate a mass of details, and nowhere better do we see that than in the second paragraph where we have all of the fog statements. Let me read just a few more of these sentences for you. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among green heights and meadows, fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city, fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping to the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships. Okay, now aside from the front-loaded fog in every one of those sentences, you also get all of the details that we have of London. We have the meadows, we have the Kentish heights, we have the heights, we have the rigging, we have the collier brigs. We have this huge amount of London terrain that is covered here, and it's all covered by the fog. So we have this idea of the fog encompassing everything, and everything is given by all of these details about the London cityscape. It's a kind of pointillism. You know what I mean by that, where a painter creates an image by just doing a lot of this speckling with the paintbrush, and by accumulating thousands and thousands and thousands of these little pointillist specks of paint, the image comes to life. So too does Dickens create his vision of London, create the cityscape of London through hundreds of these tiny little speckled details. This gives us the impression of a hugely populated city. It's also a very dynamic city, and we can also understand just the breadth and width of it through the accumulation of these details. The first technique that we should notice is the clipped syntax, which is a kind of reportage. and then the use of pointillism in details to establish just how vast this city is. All right, now the second technique here is Dickens' use of imagery, and of course the predominant image that we have in this beginning is fog. We've already discussed how fog is this all-encompassing force of nature. It gets everywhere, it does everything. We also have this idea of the fog mixing with the coal, with the collier brigs, and creating this kind of soot, this kind of just black, horrible atmosphere that people wheeze in and then sputter out. Fog, it's encompassing and it's dirty. What else is it? Well, as we get a little bit further on, we start to see the fog coming into Temple Bar and the High Court of Chancery. So here's an example of what the fog then does as we get into the High Court of Chancery. On such an afternoon, if ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory around his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog. Okay, so we have this idea of the fog not only creating this horrible atmosphere, but fog also obfuscating things. And the Lord High Chancellor, who sits at the very heart of the fog, can see nothing outside but fog. Okay, what Dickens then does is he takes the fog and he works it into the High Court of Chancery as a means of describing just the obtuseness, the interminability, the confusion of the law, which is the great theme of this book. And you can see it here in the way that he describes the lawyers all vying with one another and trying to do their best to wheedle people out of their money. So here he is talking about the confusion which the fog represents now in the Court of Chancery. On such an afternoon, some scores of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as here they are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless cause, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat hair and horsehair warded heads against walls of words, and making a pretense of equity with serious faces, as players might. Okay, so again, the fog is not only physically obfuscating, it not only weakens the lungs physically, but it makes the law difficult to interpret. So in this very deft move, Dickens takes the visible, tangible image of fog, and then he creates a metaphor out of it, a metaphor which sustains the whole theme of the novel. The last thing I'm going to talk about is just the richness of Dickens' prose. Yes, there is the richness of his imagery. Yes, there is the perfect balance and the perfect use of his syntax. But there's just also a lot of depth and just richness in the language itself. And nowhere else do we see that than in the balance of Dickens' words and phrases and sentences. This is something that is well regarded. We see it all over Dickens' work. You might think of the opening sentence to one of his most famous novels, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, where we immediately set out this balance. Dickens does that here as well, but he has a different technique of front-loading his sentences with the same word as a means of adding weight. This is a well-known rhetorical strategy called anaphora, where you begin all of the sentences in the same way. One might think of Winston Churchill. We will fight on the beaches, we will fight on the streets, etc. There are so many instances of this, but I'll just read one that comes from a little bit before the paragraph I just sampled. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. Okay, so I hope you saw it right there. All of the sentences are structured in the same way as a means of adding weight and also sort of making the hyperbolic case for just how encompassing this fog is. Here's another one. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. So there we have our anaphora, there we have the hyperbole, there also we have Dickens' famous use of sarcasm, which we see all over this passage and in the beginning of the passage where he talks about a megalosaurus wandering through the streets. Just a few other things that Dickens is so good at. One of those is the way that Dickens very quickly characterizes his minor characters. So for example, we have the Lord High Chancellor, that's probably the most predominant character we see, but there's also the person he's talking to, who, and here we have him, is a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief. Okay, so we have a great advocate, with little whiskers and an interminable brief. So right there we have this set of contradictions. A big guy with a tiny voice, and he has a never-ending brief, which is supposed to be brief. What is Dickens doing? Why is he doing this? Well, he's characterizing, he's burlesquing the court, and he's giving you a series of these images to fix even the minor characters in your head. What you come out with is a person that doesn't really make sense, or he appears absurd, and that of course is Dickens' point. Another wonderful characterization we have is of the Lord High Chancellor. It's not a whole lot, but just listen to how he's described. If ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains. So a foggy glory around his head, it's almost a religious emblem, and then we have crimson cloth and curtains that surround him in, as though he were the high priest in some religious procession. So right there, again, Dickens is burlesquing imagery from a religious tradition or another tradition in order to characterize his people. There are so many other things that I could talk about with this opening, but just to summarize briefly, there is Dickens' use of syntax, his clipped sentences, which is a means of him to pile up image after image just to create the complexity and the depth of his setting. The other is his image of fog. This begins as a physical image, but it quickly morphs into the metaphorical as a means of talking about the theme, which is the obtuseness of the law. And the last one is just the richness of the language itself through personification, through hyperbole, through imagery, through characterization. Dickens is a master of giving us this immediate impression of his world, and it is for that reason that we continue to read him today. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching that. If you enjoyed that, go ahead and consider subscribing to my channel or also following me on Substack. And if you really like what I do, you might also consider checking out my book, Cheers! Around the World in 80 Toasts, a compendium of all the different ways to toast around the world. Thank you so much. Happy reading!